Okay, so I'm going to give you some basics about survey design. How you design your survey can really make or break your project. We're going to talk about some of the larger issues in class, but here are some basic issues about survey design. First being that your survey has to be enticing and easy to read. This sounds very obvious, but you'd be surprised how often students go wrong in terms of not paying attention to the design of their survey. Right? So a good survey is very uncluttered, so it's very easy to read the questions. There's a lot of space between questions, whether that's online or on a piece of paper. There's very clear instructions as to how to answer questions, whether people should be checking boxes or circling things, whether everyone should answer certain questions or only some people should. There are clear prompts as to what you expect the person to do during the survey, right? So you need to be very, very, very transparent. It really helps to have people who are unfamiliar with your project read your survey beforehand to make sure that what you expect of the person taking the survey is very, very clear. It's also good to be consistent in the types of response options that you have. If you're expecting people to change how they're answering questions for each question, for example, in one question they're supposed to circle things, and in other questions they're supposed to use buttons or use some sort of code number, like writing a number for their response. If you switch that up too much, it can be very confusing for the person answering your survey. You also need to be careful about things like length. So this really depends on your data collection method. People have the highest tolerance for long surveys if they're given face-to-face or over the phone. Part of that is because we have the social norms about not ending surveys early if it's being administered by an actual person talking to you. So most of the major long surveys that we're going to look at in this class were collected face-to-face or over the phone. For a web survey, people often will only take a web survey that will take between 15 and 20 minutes. So you probably have less than 30 questions that you can ask. And it depends on how complicated those questions are. If, for example, you do a web survey that's incredibly long, this affects your response rate. Your response rate is the percentage of people who you try to give the survey to who actually take it. And ideally, you want a high response rate. Oftentimes what happens is that people turn down your survey just when asked, so they don't even really take it. But another issue is that people start taking your survey and then they kind of bail out in the middle of it. So they stop answering questions, there's a question they don't like very much, so they don't continue, or they just get sort of survey fatigue. One thing that helps is to be very, very transparent at the beginning of your survey how long it will take. So will a 10 to 15 minute survey, what kinds of questions might be asked, so the person knows what they're getting into. You also need to figure out some things about your question format. Right, so we've already spoken in class about the difference between more open versus closed-ended questions. So open-ended questions don't have preset responses that people can fill in. Whereas closed-ended questions, you have to pick between existing responses. So here's some examples. So this was an experimental variation between open and closed-ended questions. So on the left was just this open question. What do you think is the most important problem facing this country today? So people answered a wide variety of different things, actually. On the right is that same question, but with a few options. Which do you think is the most important problem facing this country today? The energy shortage, the quality of public schools, legalized abortion, or pollution? Or people could name a different problem. And what they found is that when they asked question B, most people named one of those four issues. But when they asked question A, hardly anybody named those four issues, right? So whether or not you have an open or closed-ended question really affects the kinds of responses that you get. And often if you're trying to measure something and you really want to have an open-ended question, you may also want to have a closed-ended question that measures a similar aspect or some part of that variable. You want to always make sure when you do a closed-ended question that all your categories are mutually exclusive. So particularly if you only want people to pick one of them. It's a little bit different when you have a list of things and you want people to pick, say, different racial groups they're a part of or different clubs that they're a part of. But if you want people to only pick one option, a closed-ended question should have mutually exclusive categories. People should clearly fit into one or the others. So the problems with this question are that if you have 2 pets or if you have 3 pets, there's a couple of different ways you could answer this, right? So we want to make it much clearer how people answer this question. You also want to be exhaustive. So if we ask this question, what is your marital status? Married, divorced, widowed? What if somebody is none of these things? How do they respond? This is why we see the use of the category other so often on surveys. Typically on a survey, I would include the most common categories and then have other as a way for people to write in additional options. Some examples of closed responses are asking people whether they enjoyed something and then giving them options like excellent, good, fair, or poor, asking whether they approved or disapproved. There's much giving a statement and asking whether or not they strongly agree, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree with it. And that's a really extended version of this like agree, disagree question. It may depend on kind of the subtlety of the question that you're asking. Right? So these are some examples of ways that you can write closed responses. But of course, this is not a mutually exclusive nor exhaustive list of options. Some of these are examples of what we call Likert scale questions, right? And you've probably taken many surveys that have these. So someone asks like, okay, I think the economy is an important social issue. And the survey says, well, you should say whether or not you agree or disagree with this statement. So a full total Likert scale question has all of these different categories, including a neutral category, which can be really a good option for something if you're asking about opinions about things that people may not have opinions about, right? So asking people about their opinions about Libya, well, they may not know much about Libya or know much about that recent current event. So it can be good to have a neutral category. If you're giving your survey only to around 100 people, you probably don't want all of these different categories. This gets very cluttered. So I would probably just say strongly agree and agree and kind of drop the somewhat agree and the somewhat disagree. You also can do what we call a semantic differential. So, if you want to have people rate their experience from one spectrum to another, so from boring to interesting or from difficult to easy, you can give them number categories in the middle. So you have a sense that kind of if they're between difficult and easy, it would be a 4 or 5, but if they thought it was extremely easy, they would be an 8. And that could be useful for some types of questions. Sometimes as well, if you're going to be asking a lot of like Likert scale questions, this is using strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and don't know, which I think neutral would have been a better option here for some of these. You set them up in a matrix, and this is a nice formatting option for a survey. You don't want to put too many of these in a row. Probably like 4 to 6 is a good option, but you can put questions that have the same close-ended response in a matrix. The trick with this is if there are a lot of questions that, for example, someone might agree to, right? So if someone's very agreeable about the class, they would agree, yes, this class was good, this teacher was organized, I learned a lot, the grades were fair. It can be good to throw in a question or two or a statement or two that is kind of the opposite, because what happens is oftentimes people go through and they just say strongly agree for everything. You can get a feel for whether or not people taking the survey are really paying attention to the questions that are being asked. And finally, you want to make sure that you're not having people answer questions that don't apply to them, right? So say you're doing a survey about voting and who people voted for. You want to have some way of screening out people who did not vote. Right? So you don't want someone who didn't vote at all answering that question. And we do that through a combination of what we call filter, contingency, and skipping questions. So for example, if I'm going to ask a bunch of questions about voting, I want to first ask, have you ever voted in a national, state, or local election? If someone has never voted, I'm going to tell them to move ahead to a different part of the survey. Or if it's on a web survey, I can set it up so it automatically pushes them to a different part of the survey using the skipping option or the filtering option. You also can do it, this is a very kind of me using example of what you can do on a paper-based survey, right? Where you can say like, well, if you answer yes to this question, I want you to answer this follow-up question. This can be really, really important, not necessarily about surveys about abduction by aliens, but by questions like if you're asking people about their experiences with childcare in San Antonio or their experiences with being employed, you may first want to figure out if they are employed or if they do have children before you continue, right? So this is like a really important thing to think of, like who is answering your question. And this is part of how people experience a survey as well. You don't want them to answer a bunch of questions that don't apply to them. So there we go. And I'm going to give you more details on the actual questions themselves.